I wanted to have a quick chat on the King James Version of the Bible. Now, in general, I want to be clear. If you want to read the King James Version of the Bible, by all means, go ahead. You can make that your primary Bible. But don't make it the only Bible that you study from. And there's a few reasons why. First, you're reading from a book that is hundreds of years old. And as a result, the English in that book is not necessarily reflective of the English that we read today. And so they can be using terms or phrases back then that today have a different meaning than we have today. And if you're not aware of those differences, you're not going to understand, or you may just outright misunderstand what the King James Version is actually saying. Second, in terms of the Old Testament, we know Hebrew today much better than they did back when it was translated. Well, how is that? Why is that? Given that they were closer to ancient times. Well, closeness doesn't reflect necessarily accuracy, especially when it at that point was no longer a living language. That is, the ancient Hebrew was not spoken actively in that day. What we find, however, is that there have been subsequent discoveries that have allowed people to better understand ancient Hebrew. Examples of this is in the 1800s, we deciphered Akkadian. Akkadian is a Semitic language that is closely related to Hebrew. And by gaining insights into Akkadian, we gained insights into the meaning of ancient Hebrew all the better. Another example of this same thing is in the 20th century, in the early 20th century, in the 1930s, the deciphering of Ugarit. Ugarit also is very similar to Hebrew. It's a Semitic language, and so our insights into Ugarit further allowed us to understand the ancient Hebrew all the better. And yet another example is the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Having this wide variety of ancient Hebrew texts that's not just the Bible gave us insights into the use of the language, into the culture and the historical context of the Bible that further allowed us to understand things that were written. The same thing carries forward into the New Testament. Through further study of Koine Greek, we have learned it better today than they understood it back when the King James Version was translated. As a simple example, Granville Sharp, Sharp's rule or rules, was not yet identified when the King James Version was translated. And so there are texts where this is not accounted for, and so there are some accuracy issues. There are also issues concerning textual criticism, and that is to say, identifying the original reading of the manuscripts of the Greek New Testament. When we look at the King James Version, it was built or translated from a Greek critical text known as the Textus Receptus, which was compiled by Erasmus. The problem Erasmus faced is he had a very limited supply of Greek manuscripts available in order to produce his translation. Through further study and research and analyzing many more Greek texts that are available, we have identified that there are a number of readings in Erasmus's critical text that simply are not accurate. And so as a result, the latest scholarship shows us these things, and this is better reflected in more modern Bible translations. Now, even then, research continues, and so there are some translations that don't even reflect, and most in fact, the latest critical scholarship on the manuscripts of the New Testament and their reading. As an example, in Jude 1:5, should it say Lord or should it say Jesus? Well, the latest work in textual criticism has actually determined that the original reading was most likely Jesus in that verse, not Lord or God, as we'll see in other translations. And so the research continues, the learning continues. Now, ultimately, are things like that theologically significant? Not really. They don't bring about any theological change where our doctrine is somehow wrong in those cases. But what this does come back to is how fringe groups can manipulate the text of the Bible by trying to say it says something that it doesn't actually mean, And without the proper research and proper study, one can't determine that. By using more modern Bible translations and having them as a resource available when we study, even if we are reading primarily from the King James Version, we are able to understand what's going on when we come to questionable texts. Now, we can also use lexicons. Many people, and I've used it on here, like to go to Blue Letter Bible. Now, one of the mistakes people make is they'll look at the outline of biblical usage and they will just pick for themselves whatever usage they think is appropriate. That's not how that works. We don't just get to pick whatever reading we want the text to say. What we do instead, as we're doing research, is we open the lexicons. We go into the lexicons and we find the verse in question if it is cited, and we look at the definition that applies to that particular verse. As an example, I recently did a video that covered Revelation 7:9 and 5:9, where the Greek term phule is rendered tribe or kinsman. Some people will go into Blue Letter Bible and they'll go to the outline of biblical usage and they'll say, see, it says here the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, that's not the meaning that applies in that text. How do we know? Because the outline of biblical usage in the New Testament is cited from Thayer's lexicon. We go down just a little bit and expand Thayer's lexicon in Blue Letter Bible, and we look at the definitions, and we see the verses where the definitions apply. So when we look at Revelation 5:9 and 7:9, we see that it does not there refer to the tribes of Israel. It refers to the tribes of earth, the tribes of mankind. That's the application in that text. And so we have to be very careful about how we use scholarly resources, because if somebody doesn't understand how they work, they can misrepresent them and distort the actual meaning of the Bible. And this is common as well. I've seen this often when dealing with Greek prepositions, which I've talked about here before, where depending upon how the sentence is constructed, the meaning and use of a preposition like from, by, out of, through, because of, would be translated from dia, the Greek preposition, ek, ice, into. All these different prepositions have different meanings dependent upon how they are used in the sentence. And so we can't just go and pick any definition we want, because there are grammatical requirements to allow for particular definitions to apply. So those are just a few points I want people to consider, to think about as they're studying the Bible, as they're using the King James Version or any other translation, and as they're looking at scholarly resources. It's important to understand how these resources work in order to leverage them properly. Otherwise, you can walk away with a very distorted view of